Well, to start with, thank you very much for finding time to meet us here on the sidelines of Gaidar Forum arranged by the Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration.
As we say, it's my pleasure.
Yes, thank you very much. And Invest Foresight is a bilingual Russian online magazine on problems of investments, innovations, finance, new technologies, and things like that. And therefore, if I may, in this regard, how would you, well, to start with, characterize the current situation with investments going in Russia from the outside world and from Russia elsewhere?
Well, in Russia, from the outside world, inward investment, in other words, it's not all that different from what it has been for a very long time, certainly for 20 years, but even more. And that is the stability of the relevant Russian legislation and investment climate is not taken for granted, because it's liable to be altered, and it's liable to be altered to the disadvantage of individual companies who attract the attention of the Russian authorities either because of unexpected success or because of conduct in other ways which doesn't suit the Russian polity as it exists. The point is, everywhere large-scale investment has a political dimension. Well, in Russia, the political dimension is even greater than it is in other countries. Experience has shown that there is liable to be a sudden change in climate. For instance, excessive profit in the eyes of the Russian authorities is liable to lead directly to measures which disadvantage and possibly discourage the company from even remaining in Russia. And knowing that there have been cases of this, I prefer not to name individual names, but obviously in the oil sector it's been particularly conspicuous, knowing that there is a certain probability, I don't say that it's bound to happen, but because of the probability of unfavorable changes in legislation and in policy, people are hesitant up front to invest. At the same time, I don't want to overstress this, the fact is that the Russian natural resource sector, and the fuel sector in particular, is of such global importance that a company wishing to play a significant part in the global economy in such sectors cannot ignore Russia.
It has to be present here.
And would like to receive a welcome for coming in, would like to come in, but would like to achieve a promise of a guaranteed stability in the tax regime and the structure of shareholding regime and other aspects before doing so. So it's a question of balance.
Therefore, would you say that present-day predominantly outflow of capitals from Russia will be someday reversed?
Oh, yes, I would say, look, there have ever since, even in Soviet times, but certainly since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, capital has flown in both directions. And on the whole, the outward flow of capital has been steadier and larger than the inward flow of capital, which has been more erratic and has been subject. Of course, you have to remember, it is foreign capital that flows in, it is Russian capital that flows out.
Yes,
occasionally,
exactly.
Foreign capital may go out, but by and large, the two different sides. And by the way, the fact that it's Russian capital that's flowing out is a proof, if I may so call it, of my suggestion that the climate for large amounts of wealth and for wealthy individuals and for wealthy companies is not altogether predictable in Russia. One factor that has motivated the outflow of capital from Russia has been the protection of private wealth from possible future changes, shall we say, in the policy of the Russian authorities.
Right, and in this regard, well, talking about the in and outflow of capitals,
yes.
What would be your opinion about the present-day fight of all governments with offshore wealth?
Yes, well...
How successful is it?
You mean against tax havens?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think some success can be achieved. Look, you can point to specific factors. The international exchange of information between fiscal authorities about the affairs of individual persons and indeed of companies has undoubtedly increased enormously, and this is leading to a tougher regime in all countries. I think it's fair to say that wealthy Russians who live abroad or have important secondary homes or residences abroad are much more liable to fall within the clutches, if I may so put it, of the Russian fiscal authorities than was true a decade ago. So there has been a general increase in fiscal compliance. On the other hand, there are clear signs that it's not going to be 100%, partly because, to put it rather delicately, very often the higher reaches of the government itself have financial interests abroad, which they actually want to protect from the general surveillance and attention of the tax authorities. So for the ordinary citizen, yes. For highly placed political figures, not so clear.
True, but we these days see new technologies, new financial technologies as well, and digital currencies, to be specific. Do you think that is a concept that's
you
going
mean cryptocurrencies?
to... Cryptocurrencies, whatever you call them.
Yes.
Well,
yeah, I just want to make sure we know what we're talking about.
Not the ones we are accustomed to.
No.
So maybe next day we will find something else being invented and distributed worldwide. Therefore, how do you see the prospects for such new instruments, new financial instruments, and their influence on national economies and on global economy in general? Whether they are beneficial, the impacts of such financial instruments, or whether they can only cause harm and damage the established system and functioning mechanisms?
Okay. Of course, one needs to take these items really one at a time and discuss each one separately, which we have neither the time nor, in my case, the expertise for doing that. But I would say, in general, the lesson of the past 20 years, shall we say, of the 21st century to date, is that both technical and institutional inventiveness in the sphere of finance has gone beyond what is really in everybody's useful interest. There are great incentives for very wealthy people to make use of new technology to hide their wealth, and the same incentives apply, as it were, in the other direction to the tax authority and to the government. They want to use the new technologies to catch up with wealthy people who owe the government money. And in general, the vast mass of the population is untouched by these events.
Yes.
So far is largely untouched by these events, well, because they're not that rich. And the truth is that there is today a sort of global rich elite. Everybody complains about the growing inequality of incomes. This phrase is a little bit misleading. When you look at the poorest sections of the world, which after all still includes a great many Chinese, as well as a great many Indians, certainly much of Africa, a lot of those people...
And a lot of Russians.
And a lot of Russians, yes. Well, okay, that's absolutely right. And for many of these people, small improvements in living standards over the past 20 years have been very welcome and very conspicuous. But they are a million kilometers, I would say, as we're not in the English speaking, a million kilometers away from the position of the super rich. So what we have seen is some improvement in the position of the poor in many countries compared to the world average, but at the same time a rather offensive ballooning of extreme wealth among a small minority. And when people talk about growing inequality, that's what they have in mind. The ballooning, the enormous expansion of the income of the richest people, too much of which has been associated with the financial sector. Some has been associated, of course, with rent from natural resources, oil and gas and so on. And we know that the extreme wealth, for example, of oil producers, and we can mention Russia here, but if we first of all mention the Arab countries of the Middle East and Iran, which is Middle East but not Arab, of course, the extreme wealth of a small number of people, either directly in commerce or in the relevant sections of government, has been a conspicuous feature of the world economy for decades. The fact that it's become even more prominent now in the last 20 years, I think, is more connected with financial inventiveness than with, and with technological inventiveness, I mean the digital age, than it is with natural resources. But I would like to emphasize that the benefits of normal economic development for large segments of the population in many countries, including, you quite rightly say, Russia, I hope will be in the long run more important than the extreme wealth of a few individuals.
Okay. Since you mentioned Russia once again, you are certainly aware of the recent policies of the Russian authorities to move away from using US dollars as a means of payment, de-dollarizations,
yes,
as they call it. And it seems to be that this trend is gaining momentum not only in Russia, which is reducing its foreign trade in dollars, reducing its currency reserves in dollars, and quite successfully, by the way. Other countries seem to follow that example. Do you think, again, whether this is a positive trend at all or something we should actually not pursue just because it makes a financial system more complicated and the settlements more tricky for both sides, for all sides involved?
Look, the fact that there is globalization, that we all have relations with other countries, is bound to lead in some ways to complications in economic life. The simplest economic life was that of the medieval peasant who depended entirely on the weather and on his skill in working the land and looking after animals. Ever since we had industrial economies and financially developed economies, life has been more complicated. It goes together with development. Now, the monopoly of the dollar, as it were, or the near monopoly, the quasi-monopoly of the dollar as a world currency, has been a source of irritation to various governments for 50 years. I mean, in France, in the West, de Gaulle complained about it, the exorbitant privileges of the United States. You know, in the 1960s, half a century ago. So there's nothing new. What is new is the rather, shall we say, theatrically uncooperative attitude of the present US president, which has given additional force to people who would rather not be so involved with the US currency. And maybe this makes life more complicated for businessmen who like it. I suspect that life had already become complicated in terms of the need, for example, to hedge exchange risk, use the forward market, use derivatives, worry about stability of contracts. I don't think today's move to diversify away from the dollar is either all that new or all that enormous a source of complications. Look, businessmen should stop complaining. They have their businesses to run. Life is full of uncertainty. This is an additional one. It's nothing terribly new.
Great. And the last question, if I may.
Yes.
Many analysts and economists, they all talk lately about a new financial crisis that we are going to face this year.
Yes.
So would you support that idea that it's just on the doorstep?
No.
No.
The truth is, nobody foresaw adequately the financial crisis of more than 10 years ago, 2008. It was very badly foreseen, not least in America, but not only. In Britain, we were very bad. We'd given too much encouragement to liberalization of finance and banking, and we had not foreseen it. There is something paradoxical about the concept of foreseeing a crisis. If everybody foresees it, measures will be taken to soften it. By definition, almost, a crisis, when in the proper sense of that word, is something that wasn't foreseen. Because if you can foresee it, you can take measures. Now, the one qualification to that, I would say, that foreseeing implies forecasting, and because forecasting is difficult and people are not very good at it, they tend not to take seriously forecasts of the need to compress finance. So if you ask me, do I agree that there's a crisis round the corner? I say, no, I don't. No, I don't agree, because I don't see a clear basis for prophesying it. On the other hand, without any basis for prophesying, I can tell you there will be additional financial crises in
Someday.
future. We haven't seen the last of them.
Great. Thank you so much. We appreciate your opinion.
It's great
Thanks
fun.
a lot.
Thank you. Well, since I expected to have to say all this in Russian, it's been extremely relaxing to be able to discuss it in English. But my previous interview was in Russian, so I've done my homework for today.
Great.